It's my honor and pleasure today to visit Dr. Bill Weber in Boulder, Colorado, who's an eminent botanist, not only in vascular plants, but bryophytes, lichens, mosses. It goes across all parts of the plant kingdom. And
birds.
And he's authored many things, and he's very rich in historical knowledge and global botany and geology. And so today we came to talk about what is a herbarium, and I think what we're going to do is let Bill just tell us the story of how he ends up at a herbarium and develops up a herbarium which has national recognition.
Okay, well, just let us first decide what an herbarium is and get that out of the way. Practically all of you have, at some stage in your early life, started an herbarium. The minute that you put a violet, and flower and leaf in a book, that is the first thing you do to make an herbarium. And that was what happened back in, say, the 1300s, when plants were very much used for medicine and food, and all of the information about such things was held by the monks and the abbots in seclusion. But the monks had to know what these things looked like, so they simply saved one of each that they could find. It was a long time, a couple of centuries more probably, before they began making beautiful pictures of all of these plants. And you can go back into the early literature and find out all about marijuana. It had a different name in those days, but you can learn there. Well, an herbarium is simply like a planetarium, a vivarium, all these ariums that you know about, and why people can't understand what the difference between all of these ariums and a herbarium are, I do not know. But herbs were what they called plants in the old days. And that's where herbaria started, probably in Italy back in the 1300s. When I finally got to the point where I was able to go to college, thanks to a friend of mine who drove me out to Iowa State, where I got it. Roosevelt put me through on the youth program, where I worked for a small amount of money, but my job was typing specimen labels for a lady who was the curator of the herbarium at Iowa State. She didn't just collect one specimen of each one. She would collect up to 30 or 40 specimens of the same plant, for which I had to type 40 or so labels. No erasures permitted. So I typed all the labels for this wonderful old lady, and when the time came, we distributed the duplicates to different museums and herbaria and sorted them out on tables with their labels and so on. So I got great experience in typing labels. And I also made a collection of the whole flora of the North Woods area on the north side of the campus, and eventually gave the manuscript to the library, where it still must be. Because Washington State had recently come into a marvelous collection of specimens of plants collected in the Columbia River Gorge area on the north side in Washington, near the little town of Bingen. And this collector, Suchsdorf, was a German immigrant who came out from Iowa and lived with his brothers on a farm just underneath Mount Adams. My job in the botany department, for $50 a month stipend, saw me through graduate work. And I needed to be able to read and transcribe all of the notes that the collector had made, all in old German script.
And that, is this the same Suchsdorf of Saxifraca, Suchsdorfii, and
That's
others?
right, that's right. And so I was responsible for the final job that made the Suchsdorf collection
Okay.
worthwhile. And so they put me on a job of illustrating a booklet on the plants of Region 6 of Oregon, which was the Blue Mountain area in the east, and put me in the field the following summer helping in the field. I'll never forget my first ride on a horse. You might understand when you think of the fact that the horse was in the barn, and I made the mistake of getting on the horse in the barn. That was the first mistake. And then the second mistake was that out in the field I opened up a map on the horse's back, and that was very unhappy. But our job was to move to help the grazers in the area make friends with the glaziers by helping move their cattle from one allotment to another. And this was another opportunity I had to collect plants and mosses. So I got to know the Oregon flora, I got to know the Washington flora, and I worked in the herbarium making all those labels, and so I really had a mini career at the University of Washington State, and they had an instructorship in the biology department. And I knew that there were specimens at Colorado, but they belonged to a private collector, Joe Ewan, who preceded me as an instructor and had left for South America to collect new sources of quinine, like so many botanists did during the war. And when I got on the campus, his collections were in the attic of the museum. So I had to prevail on Joe when he got back to America.
And how did you just started with his collections and yours to begin?
No, I couldn't use his collections. I just saw to it that he would come up and get them.
Okay. And so how did the herbarium start to grow?
Well, the wonderful thing is that I came to a university that had the potential of having a museum. At that time, herbaria were not associated with university museums. They were with botany departments. Botany departments became biology departments, then they became departments of evolution and cladistics and all of this stuff. So I worked until 1962, from 46 to 62. I was on the faculty of the biology department, working also full-time in the museum for nothing. It happened that the chancellor of the university was a botanist who favored the development of the herbarium and did what he could to help. Well, when the administration left, I discovered that the chancellor had transferred me lock, stock, and barrel to the museum on a salary basis. And that's the story. We haven't talked about exicati. Exicati. Exicati simply means dried ones. And ex-sica. Exicati are sets of specimens which are collected for the purpose of sale or exchange. And when we had this chancellor, we received some wonderful exicati which had been lost during World War I in private collections, which were later discovered at a chateau or somewhere that was not bombed out, and they were put up for sale. And Oztippo was good enough to furnish us the money to buy many of these exicati, which really, really were wonderful. I published my own exicati, that's exicatum, of lichens when I got into lichenology. This is interesting because I published, it's actually a publication. You publish a booklet with the labels repeated from the labels on the packets.
So in a herbarium, we have the general collections. In the old days, they would be filed phylogenetically, but mostly today everything's alphabetical. And then we have
That's the problem. How do you file? How do you store these things uniformly? Now, unfortunately, America has a different size mounting paper from those in other countries.
Oh.
In Russia, in Siberia, where I studied the collections in Novosibirsk, they're not mounted at all.
Oh, really?
They're in folders of paper
Oh, really?
and just lying there.
Is that due to the economics of the cost of the paper and the mounting, or just?
I have no idea why. I imagine that the same thing was true of the New York Botanical Garden, because I can't see all of those women trying to pry loose specimens that were pasted on something. And so they probably were in folders of the proper size. But the size, it's difficult to put together a European collection and an American collection. Another thing about mosses, you notice there are all these uniform packets.
Yes.
In the traditional herbaria in the eastern United States, the first specimen of the moss was on this major sheet, okay? The label was down in this corner, and the packet would be somewhere on it. You had to be careful not to put packets on the same place in succeeding. You don't want to overbalance one corner. So they began to paste packets. So as many as 12 or 15 packets on a single sheet with the label of the first packet here and the packet there. And so I don't know whether they've removed them or not, but this is the traditional way. When you borrowed a specimen, you borrowed the sheet with 25 others. But that was the way it was done.
So maybe we should explain, like, in a description of the species, the types, and relevant to the management
The
of the
important
names.
thing is that the library and the herbarium are linked, incredibly linked, because the descriptions of the original plants are in the library, and in the herbarium you need access to them, and mostly the herbaria keep their collections of books and papers. And the library doesn't like to have collections of reprints of individual papers. So that's a thing that you have to think about if you combine in any way. But the important thing is that if the books were all destroyed, you did not destroy the specimens, you can still do it again. But if you destroy the specimens, you cannot trust the written word. Is that because there must have been many mistakes.
In the, like for nomenclature, names, the value of types versus general collections, where I'm trying to go to is for those that have not been to a herbarium or understand.
Yeah, well, for every named specimen, there must, no, I can't put it that way. Every species that has been described has to be more or less officially described in a particular way for which there are international rules of nomenclature. And the type specimen is the single specimen that goes with, forever linked to the first description of the plant. And so it was fairly recently, I'd say recently within 150 years, that type specimens became so important. For one thing, the entire collection of a person who maintained a private herbarium but published could be Pouilly de Rodin, the moss collection and lichen collection of Pouilly de Rodin was at Dunkirk, and the whole thing was destroyed. Much of the collections at the Vienna Museum, which they took all of the monocot specimens and stored them in caves during World War II. And the story goes that when the armistice was declared, a group of Americans discovered the cache and built a great bonfire.
Oh,
So they have nothing left of that. So no matter how much you try to keep them, you are not sure of what you're going to face in the future. However, the next best thing is to segregate in a particular case, which should be near the door, of type specimens. The classic example was Alice Eastwood, who was the curator at San Francisco Academy of Science, and during the earthquake, she was able to run back into the building and pull out the type specimens, which she had been the only person at that time who segregated types.
oh.
She was responsible for that happening.
So for well, there's, let's say, professional botanist or taxonomist who are familiar to come into a herbarium and work and are working on some group. A lot of the people, the majority of people we deal with are field-oriented people not doing research in groups. Could they feel welcomed or comfortable to come into a herbarium and ask for some sort of assistance in having a specimen or something in a baggie, say, and could somebody help them get a name on an unknown plant?
We always say that if you collect something, send it to us the way we tell you to send them to us. But very, very rarely does that ever happen. Pictures are not good enough. They send us pictures of mosses. There are some very good pictures of mosses on the internet now, but most of them are not. But if you send, the curator will not be very happy if you send a picture of a moss you've seen but didn't collect, in case it would be a very great surprise to get such a specimen. So we don't mind getting pictures, but in addition to the plant.
Right, right. Now, the herbarium, unless it's an unusual collection, probably won't keep the specimen.
Well, if it's a specimen that is worth keeping, we keep it.
Okay.
But there's a protocol that you have to learn about. You know, you take a grab of something in a wet fan and squeeze the water out of it, but you don't open it up gently and let it dry normally. That's more or less of a throwaway.
Throwaway.
Although you could salvage much of it, but it would take some time.
So across the country, there's the big museums, New York, Smithsonian, Missouri Botanical, Berkeley, etc. And then generally in every state there's usually one or several good university level herbaria.
Most of the smaller ones are in trouble. Well, actually the big ones are in trouble too. There's a great crisis building up now as to staffing sedentary collections, which nobody looks at much anymore. But you need somebody there who knows them, knows about them. And the British Museum, I understand, is allowing its faculty to grow old and retire, but not be replaced.
Mm.
And that, unless the institution is very rich, many herbaria get bigger because many herbaria die and are transferred. Now,
People who might need help in an identification should locate where their local herbarium or
yeah,
whatever
just-
and make contact
of course.
and see, if they can get some assistance.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been to the herbarium here multiple times years ago. How many specimens are in the herbarium? Well, I guess that.
Well, over 500,000.
Wow, I didn't realize there was that many. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
And how many of those?
About 100,000 mosses.
Yeah, I was going to
And
ask.
same amounts like it. Then we speak about dot maps.
Oh, yes.
That's the big story now. Now Harrington was very, very good about it. He understood that a dot needs to be proven. And so he put on his dot map the herbarium that he saw the specimen at. And that's unique as, I don't know any other outfit that has done that. But there's so many mistakes in the dot maps because there's no responsibility taken by the person who makes the dot map to ensure that, especially a suspicious dot, needs to be verified. How do you know where the specimen is that someone made that dot map responsible to?
Right.
Very tough Tough question.
Often,
And dot maps are so ununiform now. Sometimes you just have one specimen in the state and they simply make the whole state green.
yes,
Or they put the dot in the middle of the state regardless of where the single dot is. It's not helpful, and it's not the scientific method. I mean, it's a complete degradation of the scientific method.
often, this is a very different question, but I've often thought about this as far as maps, distribution maps, based on specimens. One example is Hultane, Flora of Alaska, where it's got all those beautiful maps of the circumpolar regions and where these plants go down through North America and Europe. I often thought to myself, not a comical sense, but in a way, too bad you couldn't make like an old flip map of all these maps, and what story would it tell, all the distribution maps?
Well, I'll tell you what happened with Hultane. When I was over there at the Rijksmuseum, Hultane ignored me at the start because I was working with lichens. And then someone put him onto the fact that I knew the flowering plants. And he was desperate, absolutely desperate in his last years to be able to make dot maps of the southern mountains of the northern hemisphere, for which he could have no way of knowing. And so one day I was joining him for tea in the coffee shop, and he brought a little bunch of small maps, and I should put dots, maps of Colorado, so that I should put dots of where I had seen. And I could do it pretty well. And that was wonderful.
Another question I wanted to ask you, because I know it's one of your favorite interest areas years ago, well, and probably still is, but in phytogeography, which I have some interest in myself, as the relationship of the flora of Russia and the Altai into the Rocky Mountains and the alpine floras and the relationships, and how does that develop? Well, I have, I'm asking that as the dummy question, how does that develop, right? But could you give a short, explanation of, how one part of another continent could have such an influence in our flora up and down the Rockies and the relationships?
Or just close the Arctic Ocean and put northern Siberia adjacent to northern Canada.
And that would have been during Pangea or
No.
later?
But who knows? I don't
Okay.
know. But it seems certain that the origin of the alpine flora is in the alpine. And as you, Ralph, put it, the Arctic is just like an airport. All kinds of things can get moved around on the airport.
Because it's
We
always,
have lots of things in common, for example, between Colorado and eastern Quebec.
yeah.
Yeah. And Michigan,
Huh.
the northern
What was
peninsula.
that due to how it lobes these old,
We don't know about ages, we can't say,
okay,
but it seems pretty clear that Hooker was certainly right. Hooker, the father of plant geography, spent 5 days in Colorado, and when he got down to southern Colorado on the tall mountain, he said, "My God, this is an Asiatic flora."
well, Bill, you have positively, in many of your writings, from originating a herbarium to just students to things, you've left a monument of positive, informative work, which I think speaks highly of your Torah duty.
Well, that's why I think that one of the responsibilities of a scientist should be to keep alive what we know about the people who built us.
Bill, I really want to thank you. That this
Well,
has been a
it's
treat.
It's always
Of course,
fun.
they missed the earlier conversation.
I love to talk to people.
Yeah, well, you have a lot, and you're very sharp. Your memory of plants still exceeds mine, so. Well, okay, Bill, I think we'll end here.
How about some coffee?
We'll go get some coffee, and I thank you again.
You're welcome.
All right.